Hi, I'm Angela Frazer-Wicks. I'm Chair of Trustees at Family Rights Group and founding member of their Parents Panel, which is one of their expert panels made up of people with lived experience of the child welfare and family justice system. I am a birth mum. My eldest two children were removed from my care and placed for adoption back in 2004. And I'd like to share a part of my story with you today, focusing particularly on my involvement with maternity and children's services. My first experience of maternity services was way back in 1998 when I was pregnant with my eldest son. I was in a very vulnerable place at the time, both physically and mentally. I was on my own, had little to no support, and was very isolated. I had quite complex mental health problems as a result of an abusive childhood, and I'd struggled with self-harm and alcohol addiction prior to pregnancy. To make things worse, I had a difficult pregnancy and suffered extreme morning sickness throughout. When I went into labour, I was exhausted, scared, and alone. The care I received was appallingly poor, and I would later discover negligent. I instinctively knew something was wrong, but was repeatedly ignored by maternity staff and left to labour alone. Eventually, after almost 3 days, my concerns were listened to. It was discovered my baby was in severe distress and I was rushed to theatre for an emergency section. Sadly, this was also mishandled. Midway through, the epidural wore off and down my right hand side and I began to scream in pain. I was terrified. The anaesthetist simply topped up the epidural instead of knocking me out, as I was later told really should have been the case. Fortunately, despite all of the complications, my son was born healthy, and I was delighted to finally meet him. I was still incredibly scared of how I was going to cope alone, but prepared to make it work. 48 hours later, I was discharged home, again alone. 2 days later, the midwife came to see me, removed the running stitch and left. Shortly after this, my wound failed completely, both internally and externally, and I was faced with what can only be described as my insides falling out in front of me. I managed to stay calm, somehow, wrap them in my dressing gown, shuffle to a phone and call for help. I went on to spend another 2 weeks in hospital following life-saving surgery. I was left with nerve damage, permanent internal stitches and severe pain, but I was glad to be alive and able to return home to my son. The hospital prescribed opiate pain relief and discharged me. Again, home alone. This time, however, I asked for help. I knew that I couldn't cope alone. I was given a local authority family support worker who was phenomenal. She helped with hospital appointments, accessing benefits as I couldn't return to work. Whatever I needed, she was there to help me. She also helped me to cope with my mental health. Becoming a mum, suffering such trauma and pain, had left me in a bit of a mess. I cried a lot. My emotions were all over the place and I was struggling to cope. She was so lovely. She helped me see that it was perfectly natural to be scared and helped me to find support and ways of coping. She understood that becoming a parent had triggered memories of my own childhood and that I had suddenly realised just how badly I'd been treated, and I couldn't imagine how anyone would want to harm their child. She saw a parent with problems, not a problem parent. By the time she discharged me, when my son was 8 months old, I had returned to work full time, was training to be a solicitor, and was in the process of buying my own home. Sadly, what I'd not realised was that I'd become dependent on the painkillers. Whenever I felt the pain had increased, the dose was increased. I didn't understand the risks of addiction. I simply trusted the doctors. Sadly, I then went on to meet an incredibly dangerous man. In the beginning, obviously, he was lovely and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was happy and in love. It took him less than a year to completely destroy my life. I lost my job, my home, my friends. I ended up living in his house, under his rules and under his control. When my painkillers began to go missing, I discovered he had a history of drug use and that he'd relapsed. The doctors refused to continue to prescribe them and I went into full-scale opiate withdrawal. He began to tempt me with heroin, saying that if I smoked a little bit it would take the edge off the pain. He simply wanted me hooked so that he could control me even further. and he got his wish, as I couldn't care for my son in withdrawal or cope with the pain. In a desperate attempt to get help, I went back to the local authority. Sadly, there were no more family support workers, and my son was given a social worker. Whereas the family support worker had been kind and understanding, the social worker was cruel, judgmental, and pushed me so hard that I had a breakdown. My son ended up in care. I was labelled an addict, regardless of how I became addicted. All they kept saying to me was that I had mental health problems and I needed to sort myself out. I kept telling them that I'd been trying to get a proper assessment and treatment since I was 14, with no success. My GP even confirmed this. She told them I'd been repeatedly failed by the system and that it wasn't my fault. Sadly, for me, the waiting list for drug treatment was 18 months, and mental health was the same, and I was told I couldn't even go on the mental health waiting list until I was clean. I was trapped, alone, scared, vulnerable, and unable to get help, facing the prospect of my son not coming home for years. Then, despite being careful, I fell pregnant. Miraculously, I could then access drug treatment, and I got clean safely in the second trimester. I'd been told to stop using drugs earlier than this by the social worker and had almost miscarried, so instead I decided I should listen to maternity advice. My partner left me, he didn't want a child, and I was able to make all the changes necessary for my son to come home. But it still took until I was 8 months pregnant, and no one had ever told me if I would be keeping my baby. No one cared about the emotional impact that had on me or my unborn child. I was simply expected to prepare for baby and just hope he came home at the end of it. In addition to this, throughout the entire pregnancy, no one in maternity would listen to my valid medical concerns. I told them about the previous disastrous labour, the serious complications, and how scared I was, and they ignored me. All they saw was local authority involvement and ex-addict. I was labelled and judged yet again. What they should have seen and supported me with was a very high-risk feedback. Sadly, yet again the labour was mishandled. I was left to labour alone, despite the real risks of rupture. I was refused pain relief, because I was an addict, and given 2 paracetamol. I was left alone. My waters broke, there was blood in them, so I reached for the emergency cord. Sadly, I slipped in the waters and fell, and was unable to reach the cord. I was screaming for help, but no one could hear me. I felt my son's head beginning to ground, and I was terrified. Fortunately, at the last moment, a porter heard me and raised the alarm. I was then dragged from the floor and genuinely told, "Stop screaming, you are scaring the other women." My son was born minutes later with the cord round his neck. He was freed, cleaned, and I was again left alone. My partner arrived, insisted I go home and that I take him back. It was still his house. I had no choice. He took control again. My son had what I now know as colic, and cried constantly. The only way to settle him was to rock him or swaddle him tightly. If I rocked him, I was told I had to let himself settle. If I swaddled him, I was told he would overheat. Social workers saying one thing, midwife saying another. I had no idea who to listen to. On top of this, I began to get incredibly unwell. I was in a lot of pain. I was feverish. I was passing blood clots, some of which looked green. I was slurring my speech, having violent dizzy spells, and begging for someone to help me. The doctors refused, labelled me as drug-seeking, and the social workers labelled me as drug-using. And without being in active drug treatment, I was unable to take a test to prove that I wasn't. I tried my absolute best, but the social workers were always criticising me if I was late getting my elder son to nursery or if I hadn't done the dishes. In the end, I was so weak I could barely stand. 6 weeks after giving birth, I hemorrhaged, and by the time I got to hospital, I was risking going into septic shock. The hospital had left part of the placenta behind. For 6 whole weeks, I had been slowly dying in front of everyone, and nobody saw it, because they weren't looking for it. They saw what they wanted to see. They saw a risk, when I was at risk. Once stabilised, I found out that my partner was threatening to put the children into care unless I went home to care for them. My eldest was terrified that someone was going to come and take him away again, and had severe attachment issues. so I told the doctors I needed to go home. They refused to discharge me, understandably. So I waited till no one was there, disconnected all the machines and got the bus home. I had to be there for my son. The hospital were frantic, phoning my partner, insisting that I get complete bed rest and prescribed strong antibiotics and arranged to have them delivered. The following day, my partner dragged me out of bed and threw me down the stairs because I wasn't well enough to make bottles. He broke my thumb, cracked my ribs, and beat me black and blue. Despite going to the police and to court, social workers blamed me for failing to protect my children from witnessing the assault and forced me to sign an agreement stating that I would keep him away from the children or they would remove them both. I signed, and I tried my absolute best to keep us safe, but I was so poorly I didn't stand a chance. I was expected to care for my baby, get my elder son to nursery, keep the house spotless, and somehow recover from a life-threatening infection and numerous other injuries. My partner stalked me constantly, threatened me, let himself into the house and took all my money. No one would help me. The police didn't arrest him, despite me having a non-molestation order with the power of arrest. I was beyond desperate. I walked into the local authority offices and I sobbed, begging them to get us out of there, saying I just can't do this on my own. Please, can someone just help us? The following day they took my 10-week-old baby from my home and my 4-year-old son from nursery, making his worst nightmare come true. It was another 2 weeks before I was allowed to see them, and by that point my eldest was destroyed. I later found out that they'd actually taken my baby to hospital as they believed I had drugged him. Turned out he was simply in shock, having been removed from his mum. They thought he was spaced out, when in reality he was trying to find my face in a sea of strangers. No matter what I did or how hard I tried, they never came home again. I fought with everything I had. Court proceedings were started and a full psychiatric assessment was ordered. The report said I had something called borderline personality disorder and that I needed a minimum of 18 months of therapy. I was so relieved that I finally had a diagnosis and was hopeful I could get into treatment straight away. I was called into the offices on New Year's Eve to discuss the report and simply told my children were never coming home. They were being adopted. I was distraught and couldn't understand why I couldn't just have the treatment. My children were safe and settled in foster care, and they just kept saying something about it not being in the children's timescales. I was told that the final decision was made and then sent home, alone. I couldn't face life without my children, so I began to plan my suicide. I withdrew from everything. I stopped going to contact. My partner came back, and I didn't care anymore. No one checked on me at all. It was like I didn't exist. Now there was a plan for the children that didn't involve me. The fact that no one checked on me, despite what I'd been told, is appalling. But if I tell you that that psychiatric report stated that it was not a case of if, but when I would commit suicide if I didn't get the help I needed, well, I don't have the words for that level of neglect. 8 weeks after being told my children were being adopted, I took a massive overdose. My partner found me and didn't tell anyone. He left me dying of liver failure for 2 days before a neighbour heard me crying and phoned the police. I was taken by police escort to the transplant unit, where I was told the transplant was my only chance of surviving. I was placed at the top of the list, but I told them I didn't want to survive. I just didn't want to die alone. The nurses took it in turns to sit with me as I drifted in and out of consciousness. My kidneys began to fail. I was given a central line and they tried to make me as comfortable as possible. It was one of those nurses that saved my life by telling me her own story of loss. She'd lost 2 children herself when her rich American husband had taken them on holiday and never came home. She told me she knew they would come looking for her one day. She wanted them to find the real her, not the person they would have been told she was. I realised at that moment that the only version of me my sons would ever know would be the lies in that local authority file. So I decided to fight. I was then given less than 6 hours to live. Unfortunately for them, I'm incredibly stubborn, and I quite simply refused to die. I beat all the odds, and 3 weeks later somehow left hospital with a fully healed liver. I went straight to a refuge where I was safe and finally helped to see I'd been groomed and abused. Then, on the 2nd of July 2004, I said goodbye to my then 5-year-old son and his 14-month-old brother in a conference room. I didn't know if I'd ever see either of them again. I was told not to cry and to make this a positive experience for the children. I knew that was nonsense. I held my boys and cried. They deserved to know I was sad they were leaving rather than think I didn't care. I was then completely and utterly abandoned by the system and everyone in it, despite them knowing how vulnerable I was. Thankfully, my solicitor referred me to a charity called After Adoption, who stepped in to support me. I was able to secure letterbox, allowing me to write to my sons once a year. I used those letters to show them that I was better than the local authority said I was. After Adoption encouraged me to speak out about my experiences, to try and help raise awareness of the issues facing families. It was through this work that I found the Family Rights Group and began working with them to raise awareness of the devastating problems within our child protection system. Fired on by having the support of people who believed in me, I moved away and I started my life again. I rented a room from a lady who'd also suffered domestic abuse, and luckily for me, she had a rather handsome son. We would go on to marry, and we decided to have a child. I knew we would be assessed, so I referred myself. The local authority made me wait until I was 24 weeks pregnant before they would assess me, meaning I couldn't enjoy the pregnancy as I was so scared of what was going to happen. My husband couldn't understand why I was so scared. We had a lovely life. There was nothing for social services to worry about. It wasn't until after the assessment that my husband finally understood. To this day, he said it is the single most terrifying thing he's ever experienced. A complete stranger sitting in our house, rapid-firing questions at him, deeply personal questions, knowing that his answers could be used against him, used to take away his baby. Fortunately, the social worker didn't even open a file. She saw that there was no risk and she left us to try and enjoy the rest of the pregnancy. Despite this, despite there being no file, no social worker, I was still judged on my past. A few weeks later, I needed to rearrange an appointment due to my husband's shifts, so I called and I changed the date. On the day of the original appointment, I received a telephone call from a child protection midwife, demanding to know why I had missed an appointment. I was distraught and terrified. I told her I had rearranged it, and I asked her why they had involved her, as I didn't even have a social worker. She apologised, but I spent the rest of the pregnancy a complete wreck, terrified someone was going to take my baby away. On top of this, yet again, maternity focused on my past issues and my concerns around labour and childbirth were ignored. I begged for some counselling or support, but no one ever listened. It was not until I was told at 38 weeks that I would need another section, and I panicked so badly that my blood pressure was so dangerously high that I had to be admitted, that I was finally diagnosed with complex PTSD. From there, I was supported brilliantly by the surgical team, who helped me through the entire process. I felt seen, heard and valued. I had an amazing named midwife called Ella, who helped me at every stage. We made a plan together, looking at all the possible problems and how we could tackle them. For example, I have permanent stitches to prevent any possible rupture. We only really encountered one problem, and that was when I was told to remove my own dressing. It was written in my notes that I was not to be asked to do this, but unfortunately at the time the maternity department was overrun and no one would listen to me, and I was made to feel like I was wasting everyone's time. I tried to do it myself, and was found crawling back from the bathroom struggling to breathe. I'd had a massive panic attack and had almost lost consciousness, and I still have flashbacks to that moment today. My daughter was thankfully born healthy, and the midwife and health visitor supported me as best they could with my PTSD, but I spent a full year on medication to help me cope with the trauma. The stitches were removed gradually, one every day, to help prevent panic attacks. Despite all this, I was still convinced someone was going to take my daughter. I wouldn't even say I love you to her until she was 4 months old, just in case I jinxed things. The midwife and health visitor stayed with me until I was ready to manage alone, and then I was offered a home start worker, who supported me for a long time after that. I still to this day panic and worry that a social worker will turn up at my door. The house has to be spotless at all times just in case. My husband used to try and help me see it wouldn't happen, but then I was diagnosed with OCD, and we've both just accepted this is who I am now. In the 20 years since losing my children, I've been incredibly lucky to be able to work across family justice and in maternity services, educating, informing and raising awareness of the issues facing families. Being pregnant is scary enough on its own, but if you add in historical complications and a children's social care system that sometimes bullies, labels and criticises parents, that fear can become out and out terror. We must do better to support vulnerable pregnant women. I was part of the Born into Care study at Lancaster University, looking at the increasing numbers of newborn babies being removed by children's social care at or shortly after birth. I sat on the advisory board alongside judges, academics and practitioners, looking at how to change practice. There was a group of women who'd all experienced removal at birth, who fed into the research, but were too scared to sit on the main board with all the professionals, as they were still understandably scared and intimidated by them. So I acted as a conduit between the two groups, ensuring that the women's experiences influenced the good practice guidance that came out of the research. Working with these incredible women who had all been traumatised by terrible practice was inspiring, and we began to wonder if there was something more we could do to help other mothers like us. So we came together and designed the Hope boxes. These are similar to bereavement boxes and are to be used when babies are removed by children's social care. Hope stands for Hold On, Pain Eases. We wanted to show the mums who received these boxes that they were not alone and that there were others out there who were thinking of them. We all knew how isolating, shaming and stigmatising baby removal was, and how impossible it felt to try and grieve for and fight for your baby without any help or support, or anyone acknowledging the trauma we'd suffered. There is one box for baby and one box for mum. The boxes are designed to keep everyone's focus on the maternal bond, to ensure that everything is done to give mum and baby the best chance of staying together. The contents of each box were specially designed and chosen by us, now known as the Hope Mums. There is a blanket in each box that's intended to be swapped at family time. The smell of mum comforting baby, and baby smell helping with milk production for mum. There's a baby book that we designed, as we knew generic books weren't suitable, as baby's first car journey, for example, might be in the social worker or foster carer's car. We've also co-designed the midwifery training that sits alongside the boxes. We felt midwives were the best people to offer the boxes, as there's more likely to be a relationship of trust between them and mum. And boxes are offered, they're not mandatory, as we recognise that mum has often lost all choice and control, and we wanted to try and give her a little bit back. We were awarded an NHS Safeguarding Award at the official launch of the boxes in recognition of the work we had done. We continue to receive amazing feedback about the impact the boxes are having. So many mums telling us that if nothing else, they didn't walk out of hospital with empty arms. Sadly, the number of boxes being produced shows that the numbers of removals are still rising, and we must do more to stop this. We all understand that there will always be babies that need to be removed for their safety, but we believe that this must always be done with the utmost kindness and compassion. I've gone on to lecture social work and midwifery students. I'm on the steering group for the Embrace study and the Mothers in Mind project, looking at the mental health needs of pregnant women in proceedings. I helped co-design a one-to-one support project in Hackney for pregnant women with children's social care involvement. I work with the judiciary, CAFCAS, the Department for Education, and I speak all over the world, trying to help everyone involved in the system see us parents differently. So I guess my message to you today is simple. Whilst the rest of the system applies numerous labels to women, midwifery should be applying only one: pregnant. After all, the term midwife means with woman. Midwives should feel empowered to advocate for their parents and their babies, and not be complicit in the actions of the local authority, often because they either don't understand what is happening or they're too scared to stand up to social workers. Some of the stories I hear about the way babies are removed in hospital settings are not just heartbreaking, they're inhumane. I appreciate that I can't really sum up my journey, the issues I faced and families still face now in such a short space of time, but I've made sure that links to various pieces of work I'm involved in, including the Born into Care guidelines and the Giving Hope project, are shared after this presentation. I've also included links to Family Rights Group website, where you can find details of our advice line, advice pages, and information for families on how to access support. And as for my story, you'll be pleased to know it had a happy ending after all. In December 2020, my eldest son finally contacted me. I found out that he'd been trying for years, but was told I still posed a risk. Just as that nurse had told me, he came looking. He was told things about me that weren't accurate, but this time, that local authority file wasn't the only version of my story out there. Thanks to my work with Family Rights Group, he'd been able to find me online, read all about me, go back to that local authority and demand they connect us. Turns out he's a bit of a chip off the old block. He's incredibly proud of his mum, and it's been amazing reconnecting with him. Virtually, at least, as he now lives in Australia. Last year, I was unbelievably proud to be able to tell him that I was being awarded an MBE from the King for services to children and families in recognition of all the work I've been doing. And then, finally, in October this year, my son and his beautiful new wife travelled to the UK, and I was able to hold him again and finally introduce him properly to his little sister, who by this point was 13 years old. We spent 4 amazing days together, laughing and making wonderful memories. He says it best when he says we're the lucky ones. We all came out the other side of this traumatic journey, happy, healthy and thriving. Although his younger brother is not yet ready to have a relationship with me or his sister, I know that he's happy and safe. Knowing this means I can focus my attention on all those families who are not so lucky. If anyone watching this would like to know more about any of the projects I've mentioned or the work I do, please do feel free to get in touch. The more awareness we raise collectively, the more change we can bring about for those who really need it, vulnerable women and their beautiful babies. And I'd like to finish by reading a poem that the Hope Mums wrote together for the women who received the boxes. We know right now you feel all alone, that no one cares and you're on your own. The pain that you feel will be too much to bear. None of this feels right or in any way fair. We want you to know there are others like you. We know how you feel because we've been there too. The fear, pain and loss right now will be raw. It will all feel too much, like it's just the last straw. You may feel it's all over, that you've no strength to fight, that it's all too much and there's no end in sight. Your heart will be broken, unable to mend. We want you to know that what feels like the end, it's just the start, it's just the beginning. Don't feel that you've lost, there's still time for winning. Reach out to those closest, don't hide your pain. Don't keep it inside because you think you're to blame. When you feel it's too much, that you'll never feel better, please pick up this poem we have sent with a letter, and we hope it will give you the strength to push through. And remember, we're here, and we're thinking of you. With love, from the Hope Mums. Thank you so much for listening.